dear students, and welcome to today's class. Today we are going to continue with our discussion of the poem After Blenheim, which is composed by Robert Southey. In the last video, we did a short introduction to the poem. We also discussed about the poet Robert Southey, and I have also explained you the historical background of the poem, and it is important for all of you to go through the historical background, the War of Spanish Succession, in order to comprehend the poem. And we must remember that this poem After Blenheim is an anti-war poem, and it criticizes warfare, and it echoes Wilfred Owen's famous quote, "The pity of war." This poem, in fact, is a wake-up call to seek peaceful solutions to all conflicts. Today, in this particular video, we are going to discuss the poem in detail, and here we are going to discuss the different stanzas of the poem. So to begin with stanza 1. It was a summer evening. Old Caspar's work was done, and he before his cottage door was sitting in the sun. And by him, spotted on the green, his little grandchild Wilhelmine. So here spotted means played. Stanza 2. She saw her brother Peterkin roll something large and round, which he, beside the rivulet, in playing there had found. He came to ask what he had found, that was so large and smooth and round. So you know what a rivulet is. A rivulet means a small stream. Now let us try to understand these two stanzas. Now this particular poem After Blenheim by Robert Southey, when you see the first two stanzas, we get to know that the poem has a story-like structure. It seems as if somebody is narrating to us the story. And this is a conversational poem because the entire poem is in the form of conversation that takes place between old Caspar and his grandchildren Peterkin and Wilhelmine. The first two stanzas of this anti-war poem introduce to the readers the three main characters. Now who are the three main characters? They are Caspar and his grandchildren, that is Wilhelmine and Peterkin. At the beginning of the poem, the ambience of the poem, the atmosphere of the poem is very calm, peaceful, and it has a pastoral setup. The first stanza sets the tone and atmosphere for narration and reflection. We get to know that when the poem is set, it was a summer evening, and to be more precise, the exact place was the cottage of an elderly farmer named Caspar. He was sitting before the cottage door, basking the sun. after the day's work. So he was in a relaxing mood, sitting at the cottage door, enjoying pleasure, looking at his grandchildren play in the green, in the field. And at the same time, he was also enjoying the warmth of the setting sun. Wilhelmine was playing in front of her grandfather, and suddenly Peterkin enters into the plot with a large round thing in his hand. So while playing beside the rivulet, he had found something large and round. He did not know what it exactly was. Therefore, he brought it to his grandfather to ask him what it was. And he brought it, rolling it to the grandfather, think as it was something round. So he has playfully picked it up from a place near the rivulet, and he was returning home to ask his grandfather about it. So when he found that skull, that big round thing, he became curious about it. He wanted to know more about it, and that is the reason why he brings it to his grandfather to ask him about that strange object which Peterkin had found while playing beside the rivulet. Now when he brought that round thing to his grandfather, what did his grandfather do? Old Casper took it from the boy, who stood expectant by. Expectant means the boy, Peterkin, was expectant, and this word expectant shows the curiosity of Peterkin to know about that strange object. He was looking at his grandfather, expecting and hoping to get a reply from him. And then the old man shook his head, and with a natural sigh, "It is some poor fellow's skull," said he, "who fell in the great victory." With a natural sigh, with an air of, with a sigh, with an air of relief or disappointment, the old man or old Casper tells Peterkin that it was a skull of some poor fellow, of some poor soldier who had died in the Spanish War of Succession, who fell means who died, in the great victory. Great victory, the great victory here refers to the battle in which the English defeated the French. And then old Casper goes on to tell Peterkin and Wilhelmine that he often finds these skulls in the garden. He says, "I find them in the garden, for there is many hereabout. And often when I go to plough the garden, the ploughshare turns them out." The ploughshare means the broad blade of a plough. Now, the ploughshare turns those skulls out. "For many thousand men," said he, "were slain in that great victory." For many thousand men, many thousand soldiers died, were slain in that great victory. Now let us try to understand these two stanzas. Now when Peterkin came with that round roll thing in order to ask his grandfather what was it, old Casper takes that round object from Peterkin, and with a natural sigh he tells them, or he replied Peterkin, that it is a skull. For the first time in the poem, Caspar refers to the Battle of Blenheim here. He says that the person or the soldier whose skull Peterkin had found near the rivulet might have died in the great battle. Take note, great battle. Now Caspar is unaware of the details of the battle. He does not know about the details of the battle, the purpose of the battle, the reason of the conflict, but he believes that it was a famous victory in English history. From the next section of the poem, Caspar starts to tell his grandchildren, Peterkin and Blenheim, about the effects of the war. In that war, in that famous Battle of Blenheim, many men died and the dead bodies were buried underground. Caspar informs his grandchildren that he finds the skulls of those people when he goes to plough his garden. Such was the degree of bloodshed at that great victory. Imagine if a farmer can find the skulls while ploughing his garden, then imagine how many men must have been dead in that great battle. So that was the degree of bloodshed at that great victory. But the commoners, the common people, like old Caspar, consider it to be a great achievement for their nation. The poet, in fact, criticizes such wars and he rejects this kind of hollow nationalism. And see, as I told you before, Robert Southey's poem After Blenheim is an anti-war poem in the form of a ballad. We need to understand what a ballad is. A ballad is a long narrative poem that tells us a story. And if you see, this poem also is a narrative poem, and it is in the structure is that of a story, and it is heightened narration. And it is not a simple narration. Heightened narration that makes use of different techniques like a rhyming scheme, figures of speech, etc. This particular poem, After Blenheim, narrates the story of Caspar and his two grandchildren engaged in a conversation about the famous battle in the War of Spanish Succession, which began in 1701 and continued till 1714. Old Caspar unquestioningly accepts the loss of innocent lives in the Battle of Blenheim as the prize of the glorious victory in the war. It appears that old Caspar has resigned himself to the fact that people do die in wars. Throughout the poem, old Caspar is seen repeating that the victory was great and famous. But what is ironical is that he is ignorant of the cause of the war. Caspar's complacency is like that of a modern politician who dismiss the deaths of innocent people in war by referring to them with the impersonal phrase that is collateral damage. That whenever there will be war, people will die. Now, the poet in this particular poem has also made use of a refrain. Let us understand what a refrain is. A refrain is a phrase, verse, or group of verses repeated at regular intervals throughout the poem, especially at the end of each stanza. In the poem, the poet has repeated the phrase, the great victory and a famous victory, with little variations. If you will see, he has repeated the phrase, the great victory, the famous victory, with little variations. Now, this particular phrase, great victory, famous victory, has been used by the poet to emphasize the ignorance and complacency of the common man about the purpose of war, and the only knowledge that these common people have is that the war was won by their country and the victory was good, great, and famous. Besides this, they know nothing else. Let us move to the next stanza. Now Peterkin cries to his grandfather. He becomes more curious to know about the war. So he says, now tell us what it was all about. Young Peterkin, he cries. And little Wilhelmine looks up with wonder-waiting eyes. Now tell us all about the war and what they fought each other for. Now, children, as we know, are curious by nature. So both Wilhelmine and Peterkin, they want to know about the war, what exactly was the purpose of war, and therefore they ask their grandfather to tell them more about the war, to tell them why they fought against each other. And Wilhelmine was looking up at her grandfather with wonder-waiting eyes. Okay, wonder-waiting eyes means expecting to hear or see some exciting things. She felt that her grandfather was going to tell them about the exciting battle. Okay, so she was excited to know about the war. The next stanza, old Caspar tells them about the war or about the battle of Blenheim. He says, it was the English, Caspar cried, who put the French to rout. Rout means to destruction and defeat. French was defeated by the English. But what they fought each other for, I could not well make out. Caspar does not know the purpose of the war, why the battle took place. He does not know about it. But everybody said, quoth he, that it was a famous victory. Imagine, he does not himself know the reason of the war, but he says that it was a famous victory. Everybody quoted. Quoth means said. It is an old English word which is no longer in use. Okay. So let us try to understand these two stanzas. Now in the fifth stanza, Peterkin and Wilhelmine ask their grandfather about the war. They are eager to know the reason behind the war from their grandfather. In the next section of the poem, Caspar tells them that in the Battle of Blenheim, the English forces defeated the French army. But he doesn't know the reason behind the war. He does not know what they fought each other for. I could not well make out. He could not make out. What he knows is that it was a famous victory. And the last line is a refrain, and it is ironical that he refers it to as a famous victory. But through this particular phrase, the poet depicts the futility of war. And as I was telling you, children, and both Peterkin and Wilhelmine are representative of that young age and the innocence of childhood. Children are curious by nature. So when Peterkin finds a skull, unable to identify it, he brings it to his grandfather and immediately asks him what it was. Old Caspar told him that it was a skull of a soldier who had died in the Battle of Blenheim. Peterkin's sister Wilhelmine then asked old Caspar to describe the war and explain to them the causes of the war. However, Caspar is able to describe where the war was fought. He was able to describe the site, Blenheim, the place where the war was fought. He is able to tell between whom the war was fought, but he cannot explain the purpose nor the benefits of the war. He has no idea about the causes of the war. All that matters to him is that Austria and England combinedly they fought against the French and they won a great victory against France. Thus, the poem is a scathing commentary on man's cruelty to man. War, as seen in this poem, represents the worst state of human behavior. The skull that Peterkin finds, as well as those that Caspar regularly unearths while ploughing his fields, are proof of the horrors of war. A man kills another man to achieve the so-called great victory, famous victory. Anyway, today we do till here. In the next class we will be continuing with this poem. Thank you for watching and have a pleasant day.